The prison gate at Marshfield stood closed to the world for another hour, yet. The city did not wake easily in November, and the street outside the gatehouse was empty, except for the coal seller's boy on the far corner who did not look up. A woman stood at the gate, in a dark wool cloak. Her gloved hands folded at her waist, her face turned toward the small barred window set into the stone. The guard who appeared there each morning at this hour knew her by the smell of her. He had been told to expect the scent, violet and bergamot, something expensive and French, the sort of fragrance that arrived in a sealed flask from Paris and cost more than he earned in 3 months. He unlatched the gate without ceremony. She thanked him in a voice pitched low, barely above the wind, and walked through. Inside, the corridor smelled of iron and old stone and the particular damp that November laid over every surface in London. She carried a small, cloth-wrapped parcel, as she always did. The parcel held a crust of bread, a strip of dried meat, and one small thing that changed by the day, a folded newspaper, a page of a letter, sometimes nothing more than a sprig of dried rosemary from the kitchen garden at Aldenmere House. She walked without hurry through the corridor, toward the 7th cell on the left, and the guard who escorted her did not speak, because she had never given him a reason to. What no one knew, not the guard, not the coal seller's boy, not the Season's gossip network that had spent 3 months dissecting the downfall of the Duke of Aldenmere, was that the woman in the violet perfume was not who they believed her to be. She was not Lady Isabel Vane. She had never been Lady Isabel Vane in her life. Her name was Cecily Haverford, and she was the Duchess of Aldenmere, and she had been coming here every morning for 11 weeks. The November of 1812 was the coldest Cecily could remember since her childhood, and she could not afford to remember her childhood often. She had other things to track. She had a solicitor named Mr. Phelps who met her on Tuesdays in the back room of a coffeehouse on Fleet Street and gave her documents she studied by firelight after the household retired. She had a maid named Agnes who knew and did not ask. She had a coat she kept on a separate hook from her other things, and a pair of gloves she washed herself so that the scent would hold. The Aldenmere estate stood under creditor supervision since August, which meant that every candle Cecily burned past 10 o'clock was a small act of financial transgression she calculated against the days remaining before Mr. Cree. Phelps's evidence was ready. She burned the candles anyway. The estate itself was not her concern in the legal sense. The creditor's man, a Mr. Fellows, came on the first Monday of each month to review the accounts and remind her, with the practiced courtesy of a man paid to be unpleasant, that the arrangement was temporary. Cecily received him in the drawing-room in her best morning gown and offered him tea and told him precisely what the accounts showed, which was that the Aldenmere household was running at a modest surplus, owing to certain economizations she had made in August. Mr. Fellows wrote things down. He did not thank her. She did not require it. The staff knew. Servants always know more than their employers imagine, and the Aldenmere staff were long established and sharply observant. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bramble, had been at the estate for 23 years and had known Robert from boyhood, and she had looked at Cecily in the first week of September and said with the specificity of a woman who does not waste her words, "What do you need from me, Your Grace?" Cecily had told her. Mrs. Bramble had nodded and never asked again. She had not been born a duchess. Her father had been a clergyman of modest means in Shropshire, and her education had been thorough, and her dowry had not been substantial. And when Robert Haverford, Duke of Aldenmere, had proposed the match through his solicitor in the spring of 1808, she had understood the terms precisely. He needed an heir and a household well managed. She needed a situation. What they had not discussed in the solicitor's careful correspondence was what the 4 years between the proposal and the ruin might produce in two people who paid attention to each other. She had not expected to love him. That had been her own failure or her own grace, depending on how she assessed the morning. The Season's verdict on her had been delivered in several iterations, but Lady Isabel Vane had voiced the essential version first. Cecily had heard it at Lady Darby's evening party in September, 3 weeks after Robert's arrest, when she had walked into the drawing-room and heard Isabel's voice from the far alcove, speaking to her mother in that particular tone of polished certainty. His Grace had the convenient Duchess, of course. Very practical, very Aldenmere. She will manage the situation in her usual way. A pause. Or she will not, and none of us will be surprised. Cecily had stood in the doorway long enough to hear the sound of the room absorbing this, and then she had walked in and taken her seat, and spoken to no one who did not speak to her first. She had not been angry. She had been taking notes. If anyone in London's social machinery had known what Cecily Haverford was actually doing at 6 each morning, the season's assessment of her might have required revision. The machinery preferred its stories simple, and the simple story of the Duchess of Aldenmere was that she was a clergyman's daughter, elevated by arrangement, equipped with neither the warmth to inspire loyalty nor the wit to inspire awe, who had married a man the law had now judged a forger. The machinery was, in this matter, almost entirely wrong. It was wrong about her warmth, and her wit, and her loyalty, and it was most extensively wrong about her husband. Lord Edmund Vane was 35 years old and had wanted the Aldenmere estate for longer than anyone in his circle understood. He had wanted it with the specific hunger of a man who had been told from boyhood that he was second to someone, and who had watched the someone marry better, inherit more, and manage his holdings with a competence that made comparison inevitable. Aldenmere was 2,000 acres in Hertfordshire, and a London house and a seat in the county that Edmund had decided, at some point in the winter of 1811, could belong to him if the man holding them could be discredited thoroughly enough. The letter that convicted Robert Haverford had been dated the 12th of January, 1812. It purported to be in Robert's hand, acknowledging a fraudulent debt arrangement with a merchant named Croft. It had been witnessed by two men whose names Cecily had been researching for 11 weeks. It had been brought forward at the inquiry by Lord Edmond Vane. Cecily had known within a fortnight of the conviction that the letter was false. Robert had written to her once in January of 1812, a letter she still held, and the hand was similar, but not the same. The date given in the false letter fell on a Sunday in January. She had his engagement diary. He had been at Aldenmere that Sunday. She had been with him. No one had asked her. If anyone in that court had thought to ask the convenient Duchess what she knew of the 12th of January, the matter might have been resolved differently. They had not thought to ask her, because the machinery did not ask convenient duchesses for testimony. It asked titled men, and their solicitors, and their rivals, who came bearing letters. Cecily had decided she would give them something better than her word. She would give them the letter's origins. Mr. Phelps had found the paper merchant on the 3rd week of October. The merchant's name was Amos Gill, and he kept a shop in Southwark, and he had sold a specific lot of heavy cream paper in November of 1811 to a gentleman he remembered because the gentleman had paid cash and had not given his name, and had seemed impatient about a particular finishing process. The paper's finishing process was specific enough that Mr. Phelps had matched it to the false letter by examination. The cash ledger entry was in the merchant's hand and dated the 15th of November, 1811. The merchant had described the gentleman. His description matched Lord Edmund Vane with enough particularity to be of use. This was what Cecily carried to Fleet Street on Tuesday mornings in the thin leather case beneath her cloak. Mr. Playa, Phelps was a small, precise man of 50, with spectacles he wore on his nose rather than his forehead, which Cecily had noted as a sign of a man who preferred to see things clearly. He had been the Aldenmere solicitor for 12 years. Quote, when she had come to him in September with Robert's letter and the engagement diary and her quiet explanation of what she believed had occurred, he had read both documents carefully without speaking, and then he had looked at her over his spectacles and said that he would need several weeks and some modest funds, and she had said that the funds were available, and he had said that he would begin immediately. She trusted him not because he was kind, which he was not especially, but because he was accurate. When he told her on the Tuesday of the 3rd week that the paper merchant had been identified and could be reached, his voice carried neither triumph nor doubt, simply the flat, particular satisfaction of a man who has verified a fact. When he told her the following Tuesday that Amos Gill's ledger entry was dated to the same week she had calculated, she had sat with that information for a moment and then said only, "Good." He had nodded. They had drunk their coffee and spoken of what remained to be done. The morning she thought of most often was not a Tuesday. It was a Thursday in October, the 4th week of her visits, and she had come as usual to the 7th cell on the left and handed through the cloth-wrapped parcel and taken her place on the wooden stool outside the grate, and Robert had looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He knew by then that it was her. She had told him at the second visit before either of them had decided how they felt about the situation, because she was not constituted for sustained deception of the person she was deceiving on behalf of. He had said nothing for several minutes. Then he had said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "Cecily, you cannot be here." "I am here," she had said. "I have been here. I will continue to be here." He had looked at the wall. The perfume. Isabel has a standing arrangement with the guards. They admit any woman who smells of that particular violet blend. I identified the perfumer. She had kept her voice level. "It costs rather more than I would prefer. Agnes helps me apply it, with enough precision to last the morning." Another long silence. "You could be seen. I am managing that." He had pressed his hand flat against the stone beside the grate, and she had noticed that his knuckles had gone white, and she had chosen not to say anything about that either. She came the next morning, and the morning after that. He did not speak much in those first days. He accepted the parcel and ate the bread with a methodical attention that told her he was very hungry and was managing the fact with the same discipline he applied to everything. She asked him practical questions. Was the cell warmer than the previous week? Had the hearing date been confirmed? Had his solicitor visited? He answered her in short sentences that contained the information she needed, and no more. She did not press. She noticed things about him in those mornings that she had not had occasion to notice in 4 years of marriage. The set of his jaw when he was considering something. The way he pressed his thumb against his forefinger when he was measuring a response. The particular stillness he arrived at when he had decided what he thought. In their ordinary life at Aldenmere, he had moved through rooms at a pace that suggested consequence. A man whose time had appointments. In the prison he was still in a way that had no performance in it. She found herself watching the way he sat. He was not a demonstrative man in ordinary times. He had been, in their 4 years of marriage, courteous and measured, and occasionally something warmer than either of those things. In small, unannounced moments that she had learned not to mention directly, because mentioning them seemed to make them retreat. Quote, she understood now in ways she had not understood at the time, that this was the architecture of a man who had been taught that the things he wanted did not last. There was an afternoon she had watched him in the library at Aldenmere. Not covertly, simply from the doorway, because she had come to tell him something and found him already reading, the afternoon light across his hands, his profile turned toward the window. And the thing she had come to tell him had left her entirely, and she had stood there for a moment longer than she should have. He had not seen her. She had gone back down the corridor and told him whatever it was at dinner instead. She had filed that moment in the part of herself she did not consult often. She consulted it more frequently. These days, the thing that revised her understanding most completely happened on a morning in late October. She had arrived at the usual hour and found the cell corridor busier than normal. A debtor's hearing had been scheduled for that wing of the prison, and the anteroom outside the cells held a woman in a brown cloak with a small child of perhaps 5 years, who sat with the taut, still expression of a child who has been told to be very good and does not entirely understand why. Cecily had to wait. The guard indicated the bench along the near wall, and she sat. And the child looked at her with the frank assessment that children perform on strangers. And she looked back, and after a moment the child said in a small, careful voice, "Are you waiting too?" "I am," Cecily said. "My papa is inside," the child said. "I know," Cecily said. She reached into her cloak. She had her small book there, the one she carried in the event of delays. It was a primer, modest and old, with a marbled cover and illustrations of animals in a slightly faded blue. She had carried it since childhood because it reminded her of her father. She took it out and held it where the child could see. The mother had looked up then. Her face was exhausted in the particular way that comes, not from one sleepless night, but from many months of them. She did not say anything. She watched. Cecily did not perform charity. She simply read the page that was in front of her in a low, steady voice, with the child's head settling gradually onto her arm, the small weight of it warm against her sleeve. From where Robert's cell stood in the corridor, the grate permitted a partial view of the anteroom. She did not know this. He had not told her. What he saw through the grate was his wife. In her dark cloak, with a stranger's child on her arm reading in a quiet, even voice, her face bent to the page. The child's fist closed around the edge of her cloak. He had been watching her for 11 weeks. He had been watching her cross the city at dawn in someone else's scent, with her case of documents and her cloth parcel and her composed manner, and he had been noting, with the particular attention of a man who has nothing but time, what she never said. She never complained. She never invoked sacrifice. She never implied that he owed her anything for what she was doing. She came because she had decided to come, and the decision apparently required no maintenance. He had watched her, and he had begun to understand something that the previous 4 years had furnished him with many reasons to resist understanding. When the anteroom cleared and the guard brought her through, Robert was standing at the grate rather than sitting, which was not his usual posture, and Cecily looked at him without asking. He said, "You had a book. A primer. I carry it. You were reading to that child." She was frightened. The room was cold. Cecily unwrapped the cloth parcel and passed the bread through. It was a small thing to do. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up from the parcel. He was looking at her with the expression she had begun to recognize. Not the careful mask, but something beneath the mask, still and fully present, that she had first seen at the second visit and had not entirely recovered from. "Cecily," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "Do not thank me," she said, in a tone that would not permit argument. "I was not going to thank you." She waited. "I was going to tell you," he said carefully, "that I see you." The corridor was very quiet. Outside, somewhere beyond the stone, November was doing what November did, and the morning light through the high window was the thin, cold kind that does not warm anything. She pressed her palm flat against the grate. He pressed his palm against the other side of the grate. They did not speak again for some minutes, and it was the most honest conversation they had held in 4 years of marriage. If you have wondered what it is that keeps a person going back to a place like that, day after day in the cold and the dark, perhaps you already know the answer. Leave a word in the comments if Cecily's quiet determination has reached you. The story is not finished yet. She went the following morning. She went the morning after that. November settled into the city with the particular gray determination of a season that intends to stay. And the streets were wet, and the coal smoke lay low, and she put on her coat and her gloves and her borrowed fragrance, and walked to Marshfield and thanked the guard at the gate, and walked through. She was not performing loyalty. She was not demonstrating anything. She had simply looked at the arithmetic and arrived at a conclusion. She was going to bring her husband home, and the mornings were the work of it. Seber. There was something he had not told her yet. He told her the following morning. The kind of telling that costs something and is therefore done quickly without preface. He said, "Before you, there was Isabel." Cecily knew this in the general way that households know things, but she did not say so. Her family put forward the arrangement. He said, "My title for their connections." It seemed logical at the time. A pause. It ended when a better arrangement appeared. A marquess. She made the correct choice for her position. His voice was flat in the way of a man describing something he has decided does not cause him pain. It was not the ending that mattered. It was what I understood from the ending. What did you understand? He looked at the wall. That the person I was without the title was not worth the trouble of choosing. That the estate was what people chose. Not me. He said it without self-pity, which made it land harder. I married you with that understanding. I believed I was protecting you from a disappointment. By not becoming something you would have reason to want. I thought it was the fairer arrangement. Cecily was quiet for a moment. She thought about the library doorway at Aldenmere. She thought about the particular quality of his voice when he said her name, which he had done perhaps 4 times in 4 years, and each time she had noted it like a merchant noting a transaction that would matter later. She said, "You were wrong." "Yes," he said. "I am aware of that, now." She reached into her pocket and produced a dried violet. She had pressed it herself from the kitchen garden, before the frost took everything. She passed it through the grate. It was faded to the pale, gray purple of old velvet. "So you know it was me," she said. "It was always me." He held it between two fingers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She went the next morning and found him standing at the grate before she arrived, which had not happened before he had combed his hair, or made the attempt with what was available. She noticed it and said nothing, and something in his face acknowledged that she had noticed, and was grateful for the nothing. He said on that morning, in a tone she had not heard from him before, something between an observation and an admission, "I have been sleeping better." She unwrapped the parcel. "Have you, since you came?" he said. "I have been sleeping better since you came." She passed the bread through the grate. She thought about all the ways she could respond to that statement, and selected none of them, because the ones that were honest would have cost more than the prison corridor could safely hold, and the ones that were not honest were not in her nature. She said instead, after a moment, "The hearing is in 2 weeks. Mr. Phelps believes we are ready." He looked at her with the expression that had no careful management in it. "Cecily," he said. 2 weeks, she said. "Eat the bread." He ate the bread. The danger arrived the following week, in the form of a note delivered to Agnes at the kitchen door. It was not signed, but its author was not difficult to identify. The note informed the Duchess of Aldenmere that a guard at Marshfield Prison had recently attended a public hanging at Newgate, where he had seen a woman he recognized from the prison corridor, identified by a bystander as the Duchess of Aldenmere. The guard had mentioned this to his captain. The note further observed that impersonation for purposes of gaining unauthorized prison access constituted a legal irregularity that a magistrate might find interesting, should anyone choose to raise it. Cicely read the note once, and then gave it to Agnes to burn. She understood what it meant. Lord Edmund Vane had discovered her. The third voicing of the label had come the previous week, delivered at one remove by Agnes herself, who had heard it from the housemaid of a titled woman, whose carriage had paused near the prison gate one morning at 6:30. The titled woman had seen Cecily through her carriage window and had known her, and had said to her own maid, in a tone that carried easily across the frozen air, "That is the convenient Duchess of Aldenmere. She goes there every morning." Someone should tell her that loyalty of that kind is wasted on a man who cannot benefit from it. Agnes had relayed this with the neutral expression of a woman reporting facts, and Cecily had received it the same way. The season had rendered its verdict. 11 weeks of daily effort amounted, in the social calculus, to a performance of devotion rather than a demonstration of intelligence. They believed she was there because she had nothing better to do. He intended to use the impersonation to discredit any testimony she might give at the hearing scheduled for the following Thursday. A duchess who had gained prison access under a false identity was not a credible witness. She was a woman who had broken the law, and whatever documents she had gathered would be tainted by the method of their gathering. She sat with this for an evening. She sat with the candles burning, and Mr. Parliament's. Phelps's case on the table and the violet perfume still faint on the fingers of her left glove, and she thought about what her options were. The fire burned low and she did not rebuild it. The house was quiet around her. Mrs. Bramble long retired, Agnes at the door's edge in case she was needed, and not announcing herself because she knew better. Cecily went through the documents in the case one by one, setting them in order on the table, and she thought with some precision about the difference between what Edmund believed he was doing and what he had actually done. He believed he was protecting his position. He had in fact handed her a choice that was not truly a choice. She could retreat and lose, or she could appear in her own name and speak plainly in front of 30 people and let the documents say what they said. She thought about the pressed violet on the ledge of the 7th cell on the left and what it meant to have given it. She thought about Robert standing at the grate before she arrived, his hair combed with the materials available. She thought about his voice saying, "I have been sleeping better since you came," in a tone that was the closest thing to a declaration he had permitted himself, which was the closest thing she needed. There was one option that Edmund had not accounted for. He had assumed that exposure was the threat. He had assumed that a Duchess who had spent 11 weeks doing something irregular would flinch at exposure. He did not know her in any meaningful way, which was, she had come to understand, the defining feature of everyone who had underestimated her. She could hide. She could send Mr. Bucks. Phelps alone with the documents and hope the evidence spoke without her. Or she could appear under her own name and speak in her own voice, and let them call her whatever they wished. It was not courage. It was simply arithmetic. The impersonation was a misdemeanor. The forgery was a crime of a different order. She had the paper merchant's ledger entry. She had the date and the description. She had Robert's engagement diary from January. She had his letter, written in the same week as the supposed forgery. She had 8 weeks of documented visits with her husband, in which his account of the forged letter had been consistent and specific and detailed in ways that a guilty man's account generally is not. She went to the hearing on Thursday morning, in her own name and her own face and her own clothes, without the violet perfume. Agnes helped her dress in silence, which was the most useful thing Agnes had ever done for her, and there was considerable competition. The cream and sage gown required the hooks to be done from behind, and Agnes did them with the quick, sure movements of a woman who has been doing such work for years, and understands that sometimes the work is ceremony. Cecily sat at the small glass afterward and examined her face, and found it composed and unremarkable and therefore suitable. She put on her earrings. She pinned her hair herself, the way she had pinned it every morning since her father's death, when they could not afford a maid, which had proven useful preparation for the present situation. She took the leather case from the table where it had sat overnight, ordered, as it needed to be at the door. Agnes said, "Your Grace." Cecily turned. Agnes said nothing more. She simply looked at her employer with the particular expression of a woman who has watched someone do something quietly singular for 11 weeks and has decided that it deserves acknowledgement, even if she cannot find the words. Cecily held that look for a moment, and then she nodded and went out. She wore the cream and sage gown she had worn at the inquiry in August. She carried the leather case. The hall was a Georgian room with high windows and plastered walls, and a table at which the magistrate, Sir Thomas Weld, sat with 2 assessors. The room held perhaps 30 people. Lord Edmund Vane sat to the left with 2 solicitors of his own, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has already won. Lady Isabel sat beside her brother, her gloves very white against her blue gown, her gaze moving across the room and settling on Cecily with a quality of assessment that was not quite surprise. Robert was brought in from the prison holding area at 9 in the morning, which was when Cecily first saw him, standing upright in daylight since August. He was thinner. His coat was the dark prison-worn one, not the navy he would have worn here. His hair was slightly longer than fashionable. He stood the way he always stood, which was very still, and he found her in the room immediately, which meant he had been looking. Sir Thomas Weld began the proceedings, and Mr. Fropper said. Phelps presented the paper merchant's evidence, and Lord Edmund's solicitors objected to the evidence's admissibility on the grounds that it had been gathered through an unauthorized prison arrangement. Edmund himself stood then. The so-called evidence presented by the Duke's solicitor was gathered through the agency of a woman who gained access to the prison under false pretenses, representing herself as another person over a period of months. Whatever documents were passed in that arrangement are tainted by the method of their acquisition. Furthermore, the Duchess of Aldenmere is not a credible witness. He paused for precisely a moment. She is the convenient Duchess. Her loyalty is her husband's interest. Her testimony is not evidence. It is a performance of devotion. The room was very quiet. Cecily stood. She had not asked anyone's permission. She simply stood. Sir Thomas Weld looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has been interrupted by a great many inconvenient people and has learned to assess them quickly. She held his gaze without performing anything. "My lord, I did not pass any documents through the prison grate. I carried them in the leather case you see on the table before Mr. Phelps. I gained access to the prison through a method I will describe fully to this court, and I will accept whatever consequence the court deems appropriate. I ask only that the court hear what I gathered before it decides whether to set it aside." Sir Thomas Weld indicated that she should proceed. She described the perfume. She described the perfumer's name, his shop in Bond Street, the specific formula of violet oil and bergamot that Lady Isabel Vane had been importing since 1809. She described the guard's assumption, the latitude it granted, the precise duration of each visit, and the nature of the conversations she had recorded in her own hand afterward. Phelps held in a bound ledger on the table before her. She described her husband's account of the false letter, given to her on the 9th of October, and the specific details in that account that she had subsequently verified against independent sources. She described the paper merchant's shop in Southwark, the nature of the cream paper, the finishing process that made it identifiable, the cash ledger entry dated the 15th of November, 1811, and the description of the purchasing gentleman that Amos Gill had given to Mr. Phelps, and was prepared to give again under examination. She produced Robert's letter of January, written in the same week as the supposed forgery, and bearing a hand that differed in 3 specific respects she was prepared to identify. She produced the engagement diary. She produced the household record, showing that the 12th of January was a Sunday, and that the Duke of Aldenmere had been at the estate that day and had not left the property. She named the 2 witnesses to the false letter and explained with the particular precision of a clergyman's daughter who had been reading legal documents by firelight for 11 weeks, why their joint presence at a specific establishment in November of 1811, when the paper was purchased, could be confirmed by the Aldenmere household accounts for that same shooting party. Lord Edmund's solicitors made 3 more objections. The first was overruled. The second was overruled. On the third, Edmund himself rose again. "Your testimony, madam, carries the weight it deserves, which is to say the weight of a convenient duchess protecting an arrangement that serves her." Robert spoke. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice to Cecily's knowledge, in their entire acquaintance. He said in the level, declarative tone she had heard on the other side of a prison grate for 11 weeks, "This is my wife. She has never been anything less." The room held itself very still. Sir Thomas Weld looked at Robert, and then at Cecily, and then at Lord Edmond Vane, who had gone the color of old plaster. Lady Isabel's hands were folded very tightly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on a point somewhere above the magistrate's head. Amos Gill was called. He identified the paper. He identified the date. He was asked to describe the gentleman who had purchased it, and he described Lord Edmund Vane with the unhesitating specificity of a man who keeps his memory organized by cash transactions, and described the impatience about the finishing process with a detail that made one of the assessors make a note. The household staff at Aldenmere confirmed that Lord Edmund and both witnesses had been guests for a November shooting party. The dates aligned precisely with the paper purchase. Lord Edmund's 3rd solicitor asked for an adjournment. Sir Thomas Weld granted a recess of 30 minutes, and when the room reassembled, he made clear that the matter of the forged letter required further examination under terms that made clear where his assessment lay. Robert was released on his own recognizance pending the full inquiry which was scheduled for December. He was not restored to his title. He was not returned to the estate. He was simply permitted to leave the building, which was the thing that mattered. Cecily found him in the corridor outside the hall. The morning light came through a window at the far end. The flat, gray November kind that fell across the stone and made nothing warm but was, on balance, light. He looked at her for a long moment. He had the pressed violet in his breast pocket. She could see the edge of it above the dark coat. He said, "Cecily." That was all he said. Her name and his voice in the corridor outside the magistrate's hall without any of the careful management he applied to everything else. She said, "I know." He held out his hand. She took it and he held it the way a man holds something he has been worried about losing, and the corridor was empty and cold and entirely sufficient. Lord Edmund Vane was bound over in December, charged with forgery and conspiracy. His solicitors made the arguments he would expect. The paper merchant's evidence and the household testimony held. Lady Isabel did not appear at the December hearing. She had gone to her family's estate in the north, which was perhaps the most honest decision she made in the entire matter. Robert was restored to his title in January. By then, they were at Aldenmere. The creditor's supervision had lifted in December, and the staff had stayed, which was not a surprise to Cecily, because she had spent 3 months managing the estate in Robert's absence, and the staff had drawn their conclusions. Agnes had her usual room. Mr. Phelps came to dinner twice before Christmas and drank his wine with the satisfied air of a solicitor whose work had gone exactly as it should. On the evening of the Restoration, Cecily stood at the library window. The grounds were pale with the first frost of January, and the stone of the house held the cold in a way that required the fire to be built high, which it was. She could hear the soft sound of the house settling around her, the old wood contracting in the cold, the particular language of a building that has been lived in long enough to have a voice. Robert came and stood beside her at the window. He had a way of occupying a room that she had always found notable, the particular gravity of a man who does not perform his presence. He said nothing for a little while, which was his way, and she let the silence be what it was. He reached into his breast pocket. He produced the pressed violet. It had survived the prison, the corridor, the magistrate's hall, the weeks since December, in the particular way of things that are kept with intention. He set it on the window ledge between them. The pale, faded thing no larger than a button. She had put it in his hand in a November prison corridor and said, "So you know it was me, it was always me." She looked at it, and then at him. "You kept it," she said. "Yes," he said. Outside, the frost was settling over the Aldenmere grounds, the long grass going silver in the moonlight, the stone walls of the garden running away into the dark. Somewhere in the house, a clock measured out the hour and returned to silence. He said her name once more, quietly, as though it were something he had been given and intended to keep, and she turned from the window toward the fire, and the warm room, and the long years ahead of them. And the violet lay on the sill, small and pale, and precisely itself. If the story of Cecily moved you tonight, leave a word in the comments. She carried something quietly for 11 weeks, and it is the kind of carrying that deserves to be seen.